What began as a routine case ended up being a mystery buried in old papers that would completely change the truth about a death we all thought was resolved. We received the body of a woman found in circumstances that seemed clear, a domestic accident. However, something in her story didn't add up, and when I reviewed a forgotten file at the bottom of our archive, I found a detail as small as it was crucial. That detail not only challenged the official version, but also let me uncover a hidden plot that no one expected. I am Dr. Esteban Mendez, a forensic doctor with over 15 years of experience in Guadalajara. Today I want to share with you the story of my most surprising case, one that taught me that nothing should be left to chance, that bodies speak. But sometimes the words are hidden in papers no one wants to read. Before we start, let me know in the comments where you are watching this video from, so I can see how far the story has reached. It all began on a quiet morning at the Forensic Medical Service. We received the body of a woman named Sylvia Lopez, 38 years old, found lifeless in her home. The police had quickly closed the case, labeling it as a fall accident, but the family insisted that something was wrong. My job is to listen to those silent voices, interpret what the body says, and not take anything for granted. When I went to review the file, something caught my attention, an old, poorly filed document containing previous reports related to the victim. In that file, I found notes from an earlier medical report, almost ignored in the initial investigation, mentioning an incident no one had considered relevant. That small detail made me change the course of the entire investigation, and from there a truth hidden beneath layers of bureaucracy and neglect began to unfold. In this video, I will take you step by step through how that forgotten file not only revealed the real cause of death, but also uncover a web of lies involving people close to Sylvia. Because in forensic medicine, sometimes the most important thing is not in the body, but in what those papers hold that no one took the time to review. This story reminded me that in our work, patience, meticulousness, and the will to look beyond the obvious are our best tools. Join me on this journey so you can discover with me how meticulous, study, and careful I changed the fate of a case that seemed closed forever. We received an apparently simple case, but when reviewing a forgotten file, I found minimal information that transformed the investigation. That discovery taught me that bodies and documents can always reveal the hidden truth, and that patience and detailed observation are essential for responsible forensic work. When they sent me the file, I thought it would be a routine autopsy, just another one among many I had performed in my career. It involved a middle-aged man found dead in an apartment in downtown Guadalajara. At first glance, it seemed like a natural case. No obvious signs of violence, no alarming clues to set off alarms at the police or, among us, the forensic medicine team. However, something about the way the file had been stored, almost abandoned for weeks, caught my attention. It is uncommon for a case to remain without progress or updates for so long, especially when it's a recent discovery. I began carefully reviewing every document, every photograph, every testimony collected by the agents at the scene. Nothing seemed out of place. The story of the deceased, Don Manuel, a bank employee who lived alone and rarely received visitors, seemed consistent. The initial autopsy suggested a heart attack, but something didn't sit right with me. Although it was not my specialty, I had years of experience and had learned not to be swayed by the first impression. Rigor mortis, livor mortis, body temperature, everything was in a state that could fit a cardiac arrest, but the look from some agents told me I had to go further. That's when I decided to requisition a file that seemed insignificant, almost forgotten, a small handwritten notebook found on the nightstand. It wasn't part of the formal file, hadn't been digitized or listed anywhere. It was a sort of personal diary, written in tiny handwriting, practically illegible to anyone not used to observing minute details, like us in forensic medicine. Although at first I thought it was just everyday notes, I soon realized that vital clues were hidden in that notebook. The pages were filled with dates, names, and some peculiar symbols. A few days later, when comparing that information with phone records and bank transactions, I saw a connection no one had considered. Don Manuel had been under severe debt pressure and apparently had started receiving threats, something not declared in the preliminary investigation, nor mentioned by those who knew him. This new information opened the path for deeper investigation, to seek evidence that would support the hypothesis the file had awakened in me. I noticed that the autopsy had not examined certain tissues in sufficient depth, nor had it considered possible ingestion of toxins or substances that could mimic a heart attack. I ordered a second round of analysis, focusing on more specific and detailed toxicology tests. While waiting for the results, I reviewed every detail of the file over and over again. The scene photos, the recorded interviews, even the contradictory testimony of a neighbor who had never caught attention in the official investigation. The following days were filled with latent tension. In our work, silence and patience are much like waiting for the end of a chess game, where every move is carefully calculated and a mistake can cost the truth. As forensic experts, we are silent watchers of stories others do not want to tell, and that small file taught me that sometimes the truth hides where least expected. When the toxicology results finally arrived, they confirmed my suspicions. There were traces of a poison that in high doses can cause cardiac arrest, but in low doses acts slowly, mimicking coronary problems. This was neither a natural accident nor a spontaneous death. Don Manuel had been poisoned, but the intention was to make it look like a natural death. That opened the door to a broader investigation about who might have wanted him dead and why. Delving into financial transactions, I discovered that weeks before his death, he had transferred a considerable sum to an account unknown to anyone in the family. This fact was a new twist, an unexpected complication. It was not only a murder, but related to hidden financial schemes, possibly involving local mafias or criminal groups exploiting legal situations to launder money. This led some police agents to take more interest and request greater collaboration, as the case seemed to surpass a simple disguised homicide attempt. But what really surprised me was that he was not alone. There were more potential victims, people Don Manuel mentioned in his notebook who seemed to be in danger. The file not only revealed the cause of death, but uncovered a complex web of threats and covered up murders. This changed the focus of our work, as it was no longer a closed case, but an expanding investigation with implications much larger than expected. In the following days, we worked with the police to review other files, gather new testimonies, and collect evidence. My team and I spent long hours in the lab, exhausted but motivated. Every small finding gave us a spark of hope and showed us that our work was not in vain. It was also an exercise in learning to trust details others overlook, in the infinite patience of forensic analysis, and in collaboration among different experts. The subsequent weeks were exhausting. As we analyzed more files and continued collecting new testimonies, we realized Don Manuel had been a pawn in a much larger game. His death was a message, a warning to those who wanted to investigate what he had discovered. This created palpable tension within the team, a mixture of fear and commitment. Personally, I felt I was at a professional and ethical crossroads. I knew that revealing this truth could put more lives at risk, but also understood that hiding it would be a form of complicity. That tension accompanied me throughout my work. It was, without a doubt, one of the most difficult and exciting cases of my career. Every time I thought we had reached the end, a new twist appeared, a piece of evidence that changed everything, a contradiction in testimonies, or a line in the notebook that seemed like a code to decipher. My team and I became detectives of the truth, not only of death, but of the justice seeking beyond the cold corpse. Over time, and thanks to persistence, we managed to assemble an increasingly clear puzzle, a story mixing fear, greed, and betrayal. We discovered Don Manuel had been gathering evidence about fraudulent operations within some financial institutions in the city, and that his discovery had made him a target for those who wanted to silence him. This finding not only made sense of his death, but shed light on larger, structural problems that often remain buried beneath layers of bureaucracy and corruption. Closing that chapter was neither easy nor quick. The truth we revealed through a forgotten file and meticulous analyses brought unexpected consequences. There were threats, pressures, and moments when we thought we would have to abandon the investigation. But there was also valuable support from other committed colleagues, journalists, and family members who wanted justice. Today, looking back, I can say without a doubt that this case changed my understanding of forensic medicine and justice. I learned that a small forgotten file can hold the fate of many people, that in the shadows of lifeless bodies beats a truth only attentive eyes and time can unveil. Above all, I understood that patience, detail, and the will not to give up are the most powerful tools for a forensic doctor who not only wants to find causes of death, but also to uncover stories, cleanse stains of injustice, and restore silent voices to those who can no longer speak for themselves. In practice, every case is different, but the one I share today proved to me that truth is not only in what is visible, but in what is hidden, in what others forget or dismiss. For us, every body is a book to read, and every document a key to open doors that seemed eternally closed. Thus, in the shadows of Guadalajara, I learned that truth always finds someone who listens with patience and respect, and that rescuing it can change many lives, even when everything seems lost. The following days were a constant balance between pressure and caution. At the office, the atmosphere began to grow heavy, not only because of the workload, but also due to the increasing feeling that we were treading on dangerous ground. Every new piece of information we decided to investigate seemed to raise more questions than answers. Don Manuel's notebook became the epicenter of all lines of inquiry, and little by little, what seemed like an isolated case began to appear as the tip of a much larger iceberg. I remember spending an entire night in the laboratory, reviewing the toxicology results over and over and comparing them with the notes in that notebook. It was then that, almost by accident, I noticed something that had gone unnoticed in the previous days, a pattern in the dates of certain entries, an apparently chaotic calendar that, upon closer attention, showed a frequency and order that corresponded with specific moments in bank transactions and threats recorded by the police. It was not a simple diary of events, but rather an agenda of hidden meetings and veiled warnings. The pressure on Don Manuel was not only economic, but also a psychological blackmail that placed him in a precarious and vulnerable position. With that new focus, I asked my team to thoroughly analyze not only the biological samples of the deceased, but also any strange residue that might be in his surroundings. We collected samples from the apartment, surface tests, personal objects, even clothing. We wanted to know if those threats had materialized not only in words, but in a kind of physical stalking. As the hours passed, the investigation took a direction none of us had anticipated. It seemed that Don Manuel had tried to defend himself, that he had left conscious clues and signals, perhaps hoping someone could decipher them after his death. Meanwhile, the police were investigating those mysterious bank transfers and that unknown account. The emerging data indicated connections with people who, for the moment, preferred to stay in the shadows, characters operating cautiously between legality and the dark world of organized crime. There were very serious economic implications and the possibility that Don Manuel had been an informant or collaborator, eventually remorseful in some financial espionage operation or fund diversion. The deeper we dug, the more we understood that the supposed natural death was anything but clear. One day, while reviewing a file in the workroom, I received an unexpected call. It was a local journalist, someone who had been following financial corruption cases, and who, apparently, had managed to trace Don Manuel's story thanks to some contacts. The conversation was brief but tense. He mentioned having received threats to desist from further investigation, and that other journalists had had to abandon their inquiries out of fear. That call confirmed the real scope of the plot, and reminded me of the fine line separating justice from the silence imposed by intimidation. We didn't want to become another statistic disappearing in front of powerful interests. I decided that despite the latent fear, we had to keep moving forward. I gathered my team and shared everything we had discovered so far. The reaction was a mix of respect, nerves, and renewed commitment. No one was intimidated, although it was impossible to ignore the feeling that we were being watched, that every step we took could have repercussions. At that moment, I realized that our work as forensic experts was not only limited to finding the cause of death, but also placed us at the center of a battle for truth, a silent war that few wanted to fight. The laboratory findings once again challenged the initial hypotheses. We found residues of a chemical compound, a rare poison whose use slowly corrodes vital organs, but is difficult to detect without specific analyses. That substance, used in controlled doses, could mask a murder as a death from natural causes. But the critical detail was that we detected small variations in specific tissues, signs that the poisoning had been administered progressively. That revelation shook me because it implied that Don Manuel had suffered silent and prolonged torment before his sudden death. In parallel, the review of telecommunications and encrypted messages revealed more. There were phone exchanges with unknown numbers, brief conversations loaded with codes, and a pattern pointing to an organized network, possibly criminal, operating under protection of certain local institutions. That network used figures like Don Manuel to obtain information or money, and when a piece wanted to leave the board, it was cut off at the root. The names mentioned in the notebook began to make sense, each with their own stories of fear and disappearance. It was like a neighborhood of shadows, where speaking meant risking one's life. But the most shocking came when we cross-referenced that information with testimonies we had previously set aside. One of the neighbors, who initially seemed irrelevant, returned to our interviews. This time, willing but fearful, he confessed to having heard arguments in Don Manuel's apartment, sounds of scuffling and threats. His account, where someone mentioned names but with trembling voice, gave us a precise lead to identify two suspects we had not considered before. This led us to widen the investigation's perimeter, requesting search warrants and surveillance. During that time, the nights were long and the coffee more abundant than usual. Frustration and fatigue set in, but also an unrelenting curiosity and a sense of justice that kept us firm. By then, the police had requested reinforcements to protect the team and safeguard the evidence, aware that this case exceeded any common scale. The city seemed to breathe a tense air, as if its streets themselves knew they harbored something dangerous, something we were just beginning to unravel. It was then that, finally, we learned who was really behind Don Manuel's death. It was not a simple jealous creditor, nor a common criminal. It was someone with power and connections, a figure who pulled strings in the shadows and whose name resonated among politicians and businessmen. A man untouchable until then. That revelation shook us because we knew we were facing not only a murderer but a system that protected its secrets and punished those who dared to challenge it. But it was not all fear. That discovery also sparked a glimmer of hope. We knew that with solid evidence and a well-structured file, justice could begin to open doors closed for years. We knew that Don Manuel had not died in vain, that his silent struggle and his small, forgotten archive would not just be a memory, but a living testimony against corruption and impunity. All of this blended into a mix of emotions hard to describe. We had started with a routine autopsy and ended up facing a complicated web of secrets and betrayals. I realized that forensic medicine is not only a technical profession, but a bridge between science and the deepest human truth, between death and justice. And that night, as I carefully stored each document knowing that within those pages lay the fate of many lives, I understood that this story was far from over, because in the city of Guadalajara, among its streets and neighborhoods, in the corners no one looks at, the truth always finds a way to manifest itself, even if through a small, forgotten, and worn notebook or the silence of a body that can no longer speak. Our work as forensic experts is to listen to that silence, decipher its signs, and give it a voice. And when we do, sometimes we change more than a case. We change the course of a story and perhaps of many lives yet to come. That case, without a doubt, was the one that taught me that powerful secret. From that moment on, every step we took seemed to tighten the tangled web surrounding Don Manuel a little more, but it also opened new areas of uncertainty that forced us to look carefully, almost fearfully, into the depths of what we had discovered. The system we had touched with our own hands was far more complex than we had imagined. It was not just an isolated crime or a personal revenge, but carefully woven network involving dirty money, influences reaching the highest levels, and a silence imposed by direct threat. It was hard for me to believe that in the 21st century, in a city I had always thought was close, corruption and fear could have such absolute control. I clearly remember that early morning when exhaustion finally lost the need to keep investigating. I stayed alone in the office, reviewing the notebook once again, that kind of relic that had become the core of everything. There was a page we hadn't read thoroughly enough until then, a scribble among seemingly insignificant lines, almost like a symbol or an initial that Don Manuel had marked several times. I decided to ask a colleague specializing in forensic graphology, and when I received the report, his opinion confirmed my suspicions. It was a coded warning mark, a kind of personal key that Don Manuel used to signal moments of extreme danger. This matched dates when the threats intensified and reinforced the idea that his death had been planned long in advance. The next piece that fit into this puzzle appeared thanks to digital analysis. We had requested permission to review Don Manuel's electronic devices with a team of forensic IT experts. In one of the hidden files, under layers of encryption, We found voice recordings, short messages, and even photographs that Don Manuel had taken before he died. At first, there was nothing explicit in those recordings, only fragments of conversations, whispered names, and sounds we didn't understand. But with patience and using advanced tools, we managed to decipher keywords, and in one of them, his trembling voice revealed fear, real and palpable fear. He had mentioned several people, some known in certain circles, others who started appearing in local newspaper pages due to corruption cases or links to organized crime. It was a harsh blow to realize we were facing a posthumous testimony that Don Manuel had left to protect himself or for someone else to act in case he disappeared. Of course, these findings did not go unnoticed by certain interested parties. External pressure increased with each breakthrough. There were moments when the lab received unexpected visits, suggestive comments, and nighttime calls that disconnected as soon as someone answered. The police set up watches, but it was clear we were dealing with forces powerful enough to hinder the investigation. This created a strange mixture of nerves and determination within the team. It was impossible not to feel the weight of what we were doing, but it also taught us that the truth, however painful, had to come to light. We could not let fear defeat us or allow Don Manuel's efforts to be buried under layers of silence. Amid all this chaos, we had an unexpected turn when an anonymous source contacted me and some team members. We never knew who they were or how they found out about us, but thanks to that information, we obtained internal documents confirming diverted payments and fake accounts created to launder money. Those papers also contained names, dates, and places, some directly linked to the agenda appearing in Don Manuel's notebook. The person who gave us that information asked for absolute anonymity and made it clear their life was at risk. Receiving that call was hard, not only because it confirmed the danger, but because we understood we were not alone. There were others who wanted the truth to come out, no matter the cost. This new evidence allowed us to take a decisive step, a formal complaint against several involved parties. It was a slow process full of obstacles, since the power we faced could move pieces within the judicial spheres to protect their own. But we knew we had to try, that we could not let impunity become the norm. Meanwhile, we kept working on the forensic side, trying to provide a precise and conclusive diagnosis that left no room for interpretation. The autopsy had been only the first step, but now our focus was on matching all forensic pieces with documentary and testimonial evidence, seeking to make everything fit and form a coherent narrative that justice could use. That was when one last revealing fact emerged. In one of the samples taken from the clothing in the apartment, we detected traces of a chemical agent we hadn't considered until that moment. It was not a common poison or a usual toxic substance. Its composition suggested experimental use, or at least little documented in usual criminal cases. We consulted toxicology experts specialized in chemical agents, and they confirmed that this compound had the capacity to alter heart rhythm and cause silent, irreversible damage in people like Don Manuel, who were already under extreme stress. This led us to propose that his death was not only the result of traditional poisoning, but of a calculated combination of methods that prolonged his suffering, making it nearly impossible to detect a murder without such precise analyses. It was a final act of cruelty in this story. While all this was happening, the impact on my team and me was profound. We had not only unearthed a crime most people considered closed, but had become guardians of an inconvenient truth, annoying to many. There were debates, doubts, and moments when uncertainty seemed to gain ground. How far could we go? What would happen to our testimony, to our evidence? But in parallel, I also felt immense solidarity, that of a group of professionals committed not only to science, but to justice and the memory of a person who, in the end, had left everything so the truth could come to light. One night, after weeks without rest, I found myself thinking about Don Manuel, those small moments he had recorded, his fear and his courage. I imagined his intention in writing that notebook, in creating those secret marks, was to leave a guide for those who would come after, a way of saying, I was here, this is what I lived through, don't forget me. And I felt with a mixture of sadness and respect that this is the very essence of forensic work, to give a voice to those who cannot speak, to become a means through which a buried story finds its escape, its justice, its last word. Now, as I carefully store all the files, thinking about the implications they have for our city and the system, I know this story does not end here. Because although Don Manuel is no longer here, his fight, has left us a legacy that reminds us that even amid corruption, lies, and fear, the truth always finds a way to appear, often in the most unexpected places. Sometimes in a small forgotten notebook, other times in the patience of forensic doctor willing to look beyond what is obvious. And perhaps that is the most powerful lesson of all this, that justice is not a stroke of luck or an isolated act, but the result of a constant search, the will to listen silently, to decipher signals, and find meaning in what at first glance seems like chaos. Because in that search, in that attention to detail, lies the dignity of those who can no longer tell their story and the hope of those who still have the courage to face it. That is why, although Don Manuel's case has become one of the most complex and dangerous I've had to face, it is also one of the ones from which I've learned the most about the value of patience, resilience, and truth. And I know that many stories like this are waiting to be discovered in the forgotten corners of our city, in those files that seemingly appear insignificant, or in the silence that only an expert knows how to interpret. Because the truth is not a luxury, it is a necessity, and when it finally unfolds, its impact can change not just a case, but the fate of many lives as we progress in the investigation. The atmosphere grew increasingly heavy, as if the very air was charged with an invisible presence watching us. Every new piece of information we uncovered seemed to be a key that opened other doors, but also awakened shadows that preferred to remain hidden. The curious thing was how a simple task of reviewing evidence turned into a battle against a system that, although invisible to most, wielded its power with a firm and silent hand. It was not just the external pressure that affected us. Internally, the team began to show signs of wear. Not only physical, but emotional. We faced ethical and moral dilemmas that went beyond the technical. How much risk was fair to take? How far were we willing to go in the name of truth? Knowing that every step forward could mean interruptions in our personal lives or even direct threats. Uncertainty crept over us at unexpected moments, like when leaving the lab and the shadow of someone unknown seemed to follow us. It was a mix of paranoia and reality, difficult to distinguish. But paradoxically, amid that pressure, an unexpected strength emerged. We met at night to review every line of the report, every recording, every image, searching for connections we had yet to see. I remember one of those nights when, after hours of analysis, we found a digital backup containing detailed schematics of financial movements and diagrams of personal relationships. It was like discovering a treasure map, but in this case, the treasure was not gold, but names and implications that would shake entire structures. There was still one ingredient that kept us on guard. Fear not only of what we were uncovering, but of what could happen if we made a mistake. The slightest oversight could allow digital traces to be erased, evidence to disappear, or someone to attempt to corrupt the process. Knowing this pushed us to be meticulous, almost obsessive, but it was a laborious excess necessary. Don Manuel's notebook had been an essential piece, but we knew he had been only the tip of the iceberg. We continued navigating turbulent waters, and each revelation made us feel both challenged and vulnerable. One of the most impactful moments came when, in a new analysis, we discovered that some of the recordings contained fragments of clandestine meetings. They were not casual conversations. They were exchanges of commitments, promises of silence, and plans to neutralize any threat that might arise. Hearing those voices, whispering names with the certainty that nothing and no one would stop them, was a brutal slap for all of us, because we were facing an almost impenetrable web, where fear operated as currency and justice seemed a distant and fragile concept. The most disturbing part was that these recordings not only mentioned high-profile figures, but also people who seemed to be inside the investigative system. There were indications difficult to verify at first, but enough to understand that corruption was not limited to one sector, but had permeated even the place that should have been our refuge, the law. That made us change strategies. We could blindly trust no one except the team we had formed so carefully. It was like building a fortress amid a storm surge, each brick reinforced by trust and commitment. Amid this climate, one of the most unexpected twists was the appearance of a second digital file that until then had gone unnoticed. One of the specialists found it during a routine review of the devices. It was a set of videos that Don Manuel had recorded with a hidden camera. They were not randomly filmed scenes but raw evidence, audio-visual documents showing secret meetings, crucial witnesses meeting in discreet places, and encrypted conversations we finally managed to decode. These videos not only corroborated much of the information we already had, but also pointed to a name that until then had remained in the shadows. Someone with nicknames, connections crossing borders, and pulling strings from the darkness. This discovery left us frozen for a moment. It was a definitive proof. How someone who seemed untouchable had been identified by Don Manuel, or by someone who trusted him enough to leave that hidden testimony in his belongings. The magnitude of the case had multiplied 1,000-fold. We had gone from investigating a murder with possible local motives to being at the eye of a storm embracing organized crime, money laundering, and institutional corruption. But more than fear, I felt a growing responsibility. It was as if Don Manuel had left us a mission to unravel that network even if it cost us everything. But pressure had its consequences, and they soon arrived. A few days after that finding, one of our members received a threatening message. It was not a crude threat, but a cold and calculated warning meant to intimidate and bend wills. We decided not to inform anyone outside the team, knowing that any leak could increase the risk for everyone. The force we faced was already sending clear signals. We could go as far as we wanted, but the price would be high. Moreover, problems began to arise within the system itself. Procedures that were once routine turned into inexplicable bureaucratic obstacles. Documents disappeared or were altered. Investigators suddenly changed their criteria. It was evident that someone was pulling strings to protect the unsustainable. And amid this situation, we maintained conviction that we could not give in, because that was the only way to honor Don Manuel's memory and ensure justice had at least a small path through which to slip. One dawn, I will remember forever, I received a call from a trembling voice that briefly identified as someone linked to the very network we were investigating. They offered details that complemented all the work we had done. They confessed with a nervous but firm voice that there were far more compromising documents kept in a safe that only they could open. The delivery of that information would be under strict conditions, testing our discretion and our ability to protect those risking themselves by telling us the truth. Coordinating that delivery was not easy. Everything had to be done with utmost care to prevent the anonymous person from being discovered or suffering reprisals. The tension was palpable as we waited, hands trembling and nerves on the verge of collapse. When the material finally reached us, we faced a batch of digital and physical documents that greatly expanded the panorama. There were contracts, bank transfers, written and recorded correspondence, all pointing to methods and channels to divert public funds, bribes, and coercion few wanted to talk about. That night, as I meticulously reviewed the pages and files, I understood that the case had exceeded the known level to that point. We were not just investigating a murder or a local conspiracy. We were dealing with a perfect machine to disguise illegal acts and punish those who tried to expose them. That reality confronted us with a crossroads. Go on and risk everything or stop to avoid a greater tragedy. Fortunately, the decision was clear in the spirit of each of us. The truth did not deserve to be buried under fear or convenience. Shortly after, as part of our strategy to legitimize the complaint, we decided to involve international organizations specialized in corruption and complex crimes. The arrival of external experts not only validated our methods, but also widened the chances that the investigation would transcend local barriers. It was a crucial step to create a network of support and protection to prevent the case from dissolving into bureaucracy or oblivion. During those months, the connection between forensic science and criminal investigation was vital. Every analysis, from the smallest stain to the last fiber found, became a link in the chain that supported our narrative. Toxicology, in particular, took center stage. Studies on a chemical agent made it clear that its use was not casual or accidental, but a premeditated act with precise objectives. This not only reaffirmed the criminal nature of the murder, but cemented the idea that the victim had been subjected to a silent torture designed to avoid detection. At this point, the narrative took on an almost theatrical character. The timing, the coincidences in dates, the veiled threats, and the cross-evidence led us toward the need to tell a story strong, not only in court, but also in public conscience. It was necessary to show who was responsible, but also how their power relied on complacency and fear. What surprised me most, however, was the reaction of some sectors of society. While certain groups tried to minimize the severity of the case or question the veracity of our evidence, others began to show unexpected solidarity. Civil organizations, independent journalists, and ordinary citizens expressed their support, understanding that this investigation represented a bigger struggle, touching the very heart of justice and dignity. As the formal complaint advanced and compelling evidence was presented, the atmosphere in Guadalajara changed. There was a tremor, a shake in how impunity was conceived. It was not an immediate change, nor an easy one, but a wake-up call. Our forensic work, together with the investigation, found its place in history as a real testimony that, despite everything, there is still room for truth to prevail if sought with patience, courage, and care. And as I write these lines, looking toward the future, I know that Don Manuel's legacy is not only that investigation or the documents found. His true legacy is the awakening of a renewed commitment to justice, to the courage not to remain silent, and to the certainty that even amid the densest shadows, there's a light, however small, that never goes out. That light is each one of us when we choose not to abandon the search, when we dare look straight at what others prefer to hide, and most of all, when we understand that truth belongs not only to the past or archives, but is a constant heartbeat in the fight for a better future. I know this story will continue because in every corner of the city and all others, there are forgotten files waiting to be reviewed, silent people seeking to be heard, and truths patiently waiting for the right moment to come to light. And though the path is long and difficult, that is the route we have chosen, because there is no greater justice than that born from truth and memory. That is why, at the end of the day, it comforts me to know that, although Don Manuel is no longer here, his voice remains alive in every fragment we find, in every detail we unravel, and the courage his story has passed on to us to keep moving forward. What followed that early morning was a period in which every detail took on monumental weight, not because the volume of information was overwhelming, but because we understood that every fragment, every line, could make the difference. We knew that any mistake, no matter how small, could undo all we had accomplished or even endanger those who trusted us. The tension that hung in the air was so palpable that sometimes, when I closed my eyes, I could feel it as a pressure on my chest. It was a constant reminder that we were involved in something much bigger than we had imagined at the beginning. One afternoon, during a thorough review of the new material, one of my colleagues found something that at first seemed trivial, a digital receipt with an apparently insignificant date, but with a name that chilled us to the bone. That name not only matched one of the nicknames we had heard in the clandestine recordings, but also had astonishing connections to political figures who, at that time, held strategic positions in both local and federal administrations. That small piece of paper was like a domino tile which, if moved correctly, could topple an entire structure of silence and complicity. We analyzed the document meticulously, cross-referencing data with financial movement information, searching for patterns and correlations that could give us a clearer map of that invisible network. Gradually, the tangle of people, dates, and places began to take shape. It was a system where power, money, and fear intertwined with such skillfulness that it seemed almost impenetrable. But even the most complex structure has its weak point, and we were determined to find it. What surprised us was that the more we investigated, the more aware I became of the human fragility behind those names and codes. In the recordings, the voices whose promises and threats had kept us on edge occasionally cracked under stress, guilt, or perhaps remorse. They were not ruthless mobsters. They were people who, whether aware of the harm they caused or not, were caught in a dangerous game where truth could be the most costly currency. Something in that fragility made us understand that our job was not simply to expose them, but also to attempt to dismantle that mechanism without losing sight of the human element. Suddenly, unexpected news arrived that completely changed the dynamics. Someone, unidentified and with an unknown origin, began leaking part of the investigation to certain independent media outlets. The information, though fragmented, reached a wider audience than we had anticipated and caused a media earthquake. In a short time, public debate ignited, and pressure on those involved grew exponentially. This leak brought us to a turning point. Although we faced greater risks, the truth was beginning to find a space in social consciousness. But the euphoria was short-lived. Soon, the reaction of the powerful was tangible. Obstacles and procedures, doors that closed more forcefully, Even small discrediting campaigns against the team began to appear. There came a time when we could not even go out without feeling that someone was watching us or that every step was being monitored. The feeling of paranoia was legitimate, and we lived with it day after day. One of the most critical moments occurred when, in the midst of a lab analysis that was supposed to be routine, we detected a worrisome anomaly. Some of the team's digital devices showed signs of having been compromised. It was as if someone sought to alter or delete evidence from within, using sophisticated tools we did not expect to find in a case that, for many, was still just another file. This led us to strengthen protocols, change passwords, review every access, and above all, double down on vigilance. This meant weeks without rest, without breaks, and under unbearable pressure. We knew we were racing against the clock, and that more than ever, we had to trust only ourselves. The team's cohesion became the strongest barrier against adversity. In those moments, camaraderie, a shared coffee in the early morning, or a simple gesture of encouragement were the impetus to keep going. Meanwhile, the evidence was beginning to be processed by international bodies, and the experts who arrived with us contributed not only resources and technical knowledge, but also an external perspective that helped validate every finding. It was a powerful symbol. We were not alone in this fight. Collaboration transcended borders, and we showed that the truth knows no territorial limits. However, the weight of the most disturbing discovery was yet to come. In a review of audiovisual evidence, we found a video we had not seen before. It was a recording hidden inside an encrypted file that we accessed only through pure intuition and persistence. In that blurry but revealing image, an individual whose identity seemed protected by shadows and strategic angles was shown handing a briefcase to a figure well known in local political circles. That moment was enough for us to understand. The pieces we were laying on the table were not just evidence, but irrefutable testimony of how corruption flowed and consolidated among those who were supposed to protect us. This revelation impacted us both individually and collectively because, in some way, it confirmed the worst we feared. The insecurity that prevailed was not just a product of organized crime, but of a pact of silence and complicities involving public structures. But instead of paralyzing us, it pushed us forward. I had decided to answer the call and honor Mr. Manuel's memory. From then on, we designed a strategy to make this video public without risking the chain of custody or the safety of witnesses or the team. It was a delicate process where patience was more important than haste. We knew that any mistake could work against us, and the system we faced was not ready to give in without fierce resistance. When the material was finally presented to the public and competent authorities, the response was an unexpected shock. On one hand, there were those who tried to discredit it, declare it false, or minimize its scope. On the other hand, a citizen movement emerged that organized to demand transparency and justice. Popular pressure began to change the narrative and force institutions to take actions that once seemed unthinkable. During those weeks, I watched in amazement as an entire city seemed to awaken, shaken from an apathy that had prevailed for years. Conversations in cafes, social media, neighborhood meetings, everyone was talking about the case, about corruption, truth, and justice. It was as if a spark had ignited the flame of a collective consciousness, finally demanding to be heard. But this new hope came hand in hand with increased risks. Familiar faces we never imagined seeing at the margins of the complaint began appearing suspiciously near our homes or workplaces. Small warnings translated into subtle acts. Cars parked for hours outside our windows, calls without identification, anonymous messages with disturbing content. It was a constant reminder that we were at the center of a storm. However, I also felt in these experiences a strange clarity, the certainty that we were doing the right thing and that the cost, although high, was worth it, because the truth was the only real weapon against that prolonged injustice. The conviction we shared grew stronger than ever, and it was then that we understood that this case, though complex and dangerous, had touched something deeper, the very soul of our society. It was during one of those exhausting nights, when fatigue seemed to dictate the next day's agenda, that I received an unexpected message. It was an anonymous invitation to a meeting off the radar in a discreet cafe outside the city. The proposal came with the promise of new evidence and leads potentially decisive for unmasking the hidden masterminds behind this corrupt network. Knowing where the message came from was as uncertain as it was risky, but the opportunity was too valuable to pass up. Upon arrival, the atmosphere was tense but not hostile. A person with hidden identity, whose voice conveyed a mixture of fear and urgency, handed me a small device with sensitive information. Among their words, a clear message. You are not alone. There are more people willing to speak, but all fear for their lives. The key is not to rush and to trust. Change is near, but the price is high. That night I returned home with a new weight on my soul and a flame lit in my mind. I understood, more than ever, that the battle did not end there but extended toward even more dangerous horizons. However, I also felt a deep pride for the path taken, for the resistance shown, and for the certainty that justice, although slow and tortuous, always finds its cracks to fight its way to light. The story that began with a forgotten file and an apparently simple case had become the chronicle of an intense struggle against corrupt power, impunity, and fear. I have no doubt that more challenges will come, more sleepless nights, and more almost impossible obstacles to overcome. But I also know that every step taken with integrity, every piece of evidence preserved, and every voice raised not only honors Mr. Manuel's memory, but builds renewed hope. Because in moments like these, when darkness seems to engulf everything, it is humanity and commitment to the truth that keeps us strong. And although I cannot promise the path will be simple or free of pain, I can assure you that every risk, every sacrifice is worth it. The truth, when sought with patience and courage, always finds its way. And on that path, we stand shoulder to shoulder, because true justice is not a destination but a constant journey that only ends when we decide to stop looking the other way. The night I returned from the meeting at that dark cafe, I fell asleep with a feverish mind, repeating over and over the words of that nervous voice, the mental images of the device in my hand, the uncertain promise that more people were willing to speak, but with that palpable fear that I could almost touch in the air. I knew from that moment there was no turning back. Nothing could be the same. We had crossed an invisible line, a point of no return where the weight of the truth could no longer be ignored or hidden. The days that followed became an almost obsessive exercise in verification, analysis, and restriction. We barely trusted our environment, emails, messages, hardly even ourselves. The delivered device contained a compilation of documents, images, audios, and videos that, in turn, exposed an even wider and more sophisticated network of corruption and manipulation. But they also raised new questions, sometimes even more dangerous. Who were really the brains behind the network? How many more secrets were hidden beneath layers of lies and now threatened to break irreversibly? I began to notice in my colleagues that mixture of fatigue and determination that only comes after weeks on a tightrope. The vigils were more frequent and longer, the discussions more intense and detailed, as if every conversation could be the last or the decisive one. The camaraderie of the team sometimes became strained because the pressure was not only physical. It was mental, emotional, and a kind of constant internal struggle between fear and commitment. One morning, that tension reached one of its highest peaks when we found what, for many, was a shock. One of the youngest and most promising team members confided that he had received an unexpected visit at his home. No threats, but with vague words and a tone that left no doubts. Stop what you're doing, for your own good, explicit though disguised. That warning left a deep mark, not only on him but on all of us. We understood in an instant that we were not just investigating, but challenging a power that could reach the most unexpected corners. It was not just paranoia. It was a palpable reality. Surveillance increased, not only physically but also in communications. Hacking attempts became systematic almost daily, and on a couple of occasions, important files mysteriously disappeared from our systems. It was a hard blow for the team, a brutal reminder that the enemy would not sleep, and that every advance we made could be gained ground but also lost ground if we let our guard down. But then unexpected allies also appeared. People outside our institution, anonymous civilians who sent us extra information, clues, or simply showed support and trust. Men and women who, from their homes or workplaces, shared documents even at personal risk or proposed tactics to protect and distribute information so it could not be intercepted. It was like discovering a parallel community that also fought silently against that seemingly unbreakable web of corruption. That support gave us a second wind, a renewed hope that made the weariness more bearable. It was also during that time that I learned, perhaps too costly a lesson, the importance of balancing clinical logic and human intuition. The bodies, the documents, the recordings, all that was essential to piece together the puzzle. But interpreting the silence, the pauses between words, the unspoken fears, that was only achieved with hours' patience, and above all, an open heart. In one of those moments, while reviewing recorded testimony, I noticed that beyond the words, what really spoke was a tremor in the voice, as if the person knew that every fragment they released was an act of total surrender and imminent danger. Those signals were as important as any digital evidence. The day the unexpected rupture in the team came was one of the hardest. A close figure, one of the technicians with whom I had shared countless hours, was detained under ambiguous charges just as he was leaving our workplace. The official version spoke of irregularities in procedures and data handling, but to us it was too evident. It was a message to anyone who wanted to follow the path of truth. That night, alone in my office, I felt the blow to my chest that had been insidious from the start become a fist that knocked me down, although at the same time it did not let me give up. We regrouped with greater strength, aware that this battle was not just ours. We had touched something that transcended the personal, the professional, the institutional. We became pieces of a larger movement, a gear in a machine being pushed from the bottom up. I then knew that every step forward had to be made with strict strategy and caution. We could not afford more mistakes. At the same time that pressure increased, subtle signs of change began coming from within the institutions themselves. Some authorities, who had for years looked the other way, now seemed more receptive, even proactive, though not without contradictions. A social force so powerful had arisen that inertia was no longer enough to preserve the status quo. In that context, our work took on a new dimension. To continue collecting evidence, yes, but also to build bridges, convey trust, and prepare the ground so that those who came after us would have a less steep path. Not everything was bright on that horizon. Emotional instability weighed heavily. Every night I found myself mentally reviewing the faces of those we had protected, those who trusted us and now could pay a high price. The responsibility was overwhelming. How far to risk? When to endure? When to yield? There were no easy answers, but there were convictions that kept the course steady. On one occasion, while reviewing solitary files in the early hours, I came across a detail that had gone unnoticed but took on a terrifying meaning. A name, almost a whisper amid cryptic financial documents, appeared repeatedly linked to huge contracts whose awards coincidentally matched the documents we had found on that anonymous device. That person was not just a headline, but a central node, that piece that clicked in the complex web of favors and bribes. That connection was a low blow, as it forced me to understand that the list of those implicated was longer and deeper than we thought, and that the network had woven even more threads in regional politics and economics. But this revelation did not come alone. Soon, with the help of experts in data analysis and forensic accounting, we managed to trace financial routes that started from shell companies, passed through accounts in tax havens, and returned to public officials' coffers disguised as donations or false investments. It was a brilliantly complex scheme designed to sow confusion and evade any scrutiny. However, little by little, we uncovered its mechanisms, and with every trace found, we got closer to the heart of the network. Having that evidence was crucial to solidify our position and give substance to what until then many considered only rumors or conspiracy theories. Proving what seemed improbable implied not only a technical struggle, but also a narrative battle because we had to convince a skeptical audience and media as divided as society itself. Here, communication strategy was as important as field work. It was not enough to present data. We had to tell the human story behind those numbers, convey the tangible impact on the lives of ordinary people. Thus, the case that began with a forgotten file and an envelope containing minimal clues became a living story of inequality, power, and resilience. Every prisoner of the network, every face frozen in photographs or videos represented a broken chain, a memory that needed justice. And although the fight was titanic, we felt days when the tide could turn. We were not just investigators or technicians. We were part of a movement beginning to awaken. I particularly remember an afternoon when, after a meeting with representatives of civil organizations, a young woman approached me with held-back tears. She told me how Thanks to the leaks and the public pressure we had managed to generate, her brother, who had been a victim of the corrupt system, had obtained protection for his case. That small achievement, that tangible spark of hope, seemed to illuminate the fatigue accumulated in my soul. At that moment, I knew we were breaking barriers, that our actions had a real, direct effect on lives that until then seemed forgotten. But that light also reminded us that there was still darkness to face. The corrupt network, though wounded, defended itself fiercely. There were massive attempts to discredit us. Doubts were planted about the authenticity of the files. Witnesses were threatened, and forces were even deployed to hinder judicial progress. It was a war of attrition, a clear demonstration that shining light on these shadows required almost superhuman courage and persistence. Amid that double movement, advances and setbacks, hopes and threats, I felt that the story was not just another case, but a mirror reflecting the pains and hopes of an entire country. It was clear that corruption was not just a punctual problem, but a systemic evil that had corroded fundamental fibers. That is why our work also became an act of love, toward justice, toward the fallen, and toward those who deserved a different future. As the investigation continued revealing new layers, an irrefutable certainty also appeared inside me. Beyond laws, evidence, and procedures, true change began with the people. In that collective awakening we saw born day by day on the streets, on social media, in cafes where now people spoke without fear. Every voice that raised a demand, every hand that joined, built a bridge toward a less dark tomorrow. And in the end, that was a great lesson of this whole process. That truth is not a gift offered, but a conquest won with patience, courage, and above all, with a deep faith that another world is possible. I am not sure how many more nights I will sleep under the weight of this fight, nor how many battles we will have to face. But I do know the seed is planted, the spark is real, and as long as there are those who refuse to look the other way, justice will have its way. Because truth, when sought with an open heart and a clear mind, can be the fire that illuminates even the densest nights. And in that fire and with that hope, we move forward, step by step, always forward. The days turned into a succession of silences interrupted by calls at improbable hours, encrypted messages that vanished as quickly as they arrived, and clandestine meetings in places that once seemed mundane. I could barely afford to disconnect because I felt the corruption network was lurking in every shadow, on every dark corner of Guadalajara. Paranoia mingled with adrenaline, fueling a kind of perpetual vigilance that consumed both my body and mind. Yet, despite the exhaustion, something inside me refused to lower my guard. If that forgotten file had put us on this dangerous path, it had also given us the key to open doors that had been closed for years. One night, while reviewing some documents that initially seemed irrelevant, I noticed subtle details that had gone unnoticed by everyone, including myself. They were marks, small handwritten notes in the margins of contracts and invoices, scattered numbers in blue ink, critical dates altered with almost obsessive precision. At first, I thought, a mistake? But as I compared them with other data, certainty prevailed. It was a code, a hidden structure meant to trace money flows no one was supposed to identify so easily. That changed the course. We not only had evidence, but also the possibility of deciphering a way to follow the money to its origin and final destination. I called Sergio, one of the brightest and most cautious analysts on the team, and we spent an entire night deciphering that pattern. Each new piece of data was like turning on a light in a room that seemed infinite and dim. The information started to reveal links between people we thought distant, companies that appeared to be fronts, and even small municipalities that had served as conduits for diverted millions. It was a web that, far from diminishing, increased in complexity with every step we took. But the most surprising thing was discovering that this network was not only made up of clientelist politicians or unscrupulous businessmen, but included finance experts, renowned lawyers, and even public figures who maintain an untarnished facade. That discovery raised the stakes and the danger. We realized that small mistakes could be fatal, both for us and for those who trusted this silent and dangerous work. We began to think about new protocols, strengthening security in every communication, not sharing data outside usual hours or places, using more sophisticated encrypted systems, and abandoning any hint of routine. Amid this tension, an unexpected new player appeared, a person who seemed to be inside the system, yet sent signals of support through anonymous messages as cryptic as they were intriguing. At first, it bred distrust. Was it another trick, a warning, or even a disguised threat? However, their information proved accurate and valuable. They gave us in digital format internal audit documents confirming irregularities in million-dollar contracts linked to none other than one of the ensnared politicians we had identified from the start. That evidence was a turning point. For the first time, we had official, albeit covert, complaints that had not been made public, and that opened a window for us to advance with legal and ethical backing. This anonymous contact maintained intermittent communication, always through coded messages or numbers hidden between lines of text, forcing us to develop a whole set of keys to understand each message without risking the source or our security. The investigation increasingly resembled a chess game, where every move had to be calculated with surgical precision, and every piece protected like a treasure. Still, the team maintained a kind of iron discipline despite short nights and constant pressure. I felt that, despite the fatigue, that commitment was stronger than any fear. But the slow progress of the investigation was not without harsher and more painful blows. Mid-month, we received news that one of the key witnesses we had protected from the beginning, someone who had provided fundamental data about the bribery networks, had disappeared without a trace. The alarm was widespread. Protocols were activated to find their whereabouts, but anxiety remained constant. The possibility that someone inside the system had leaked information, or worse, that the concrete threat we had sensed had materialized, was something we did not want to imagine. That disappearance jeopardized the team's morale, but also reinforced the urgency to keep going. In those dark days, the bond among team members grew stronger than ever. We were not just colleagues. We were comrades on an almost impossible mission, on a path that had pushed lives and hearts to barely imaginable limits. In moments of silence, when the world seemed to stop, we shared anecdotes, memories, or simply knowing looks that said more than 1,000 words. We knew we were creating a story that someday, hopefully, would break the shield of power and open the door to something different, although the present seemed like a fight against giant windmills. One dawn, while reviewing a testimonial video we had recorded with a protected source, I noticed something the person barely perceived themselves. The way, after each difficult question, they lowered their gaze and their fingers trembled noticeably. It was not just a word, but that hidden language implying fear, internal struggle, and an almost epic will to survive. I smiled sadly, realizing that this humanity, this fragility, was one of the elements that made our task so complex and at the same time so necessary. Understanding those nuances was as fundamental as scientific analysis or digital evidence. Justice, after all, cannot be blind to real and palpable suffering. As we advanced, the disinformation machinery began to deploy more intensely. They mixed truths with half-truths on social media, spread rumors about our team's integrity, and even some public figures started launching direct criticisms on convenient platforms. However, despite the indirect attacks, we knew well that the key was not just to resist, but to respond with facts and transparency. That's why we decided to release careful statements, always documented, seeking to break the official narrative that tried to discredit all our work in one fell swoop. That battle in the media field was an extra challenge, a rough and unpredictable terrain, where information could be both a weapon and a target. We learned then that truth is not enough if it is not told well, and that the narrative must be built patiently, but without ceding ground. The stories of every affected person, every voice that had chosen to rise amid fear, were the substance to build bridges with society. Justice is legitimized not only in courts, but in the collective conviction that grows when people can look directly into the faces of those who suffer injustice. There was a critical moment when the local administration tried to stop the investigation through a court order seeking to freeze part of our work, accessing documents, making copies, and holding essential meetings. It was a blow that left us hanging, but also served to reaffirm the importance of external alliances, those civil organizations that became our echoes and voices. Thanks to their intervention and the social pressure they helped mobilize, we were able to overturn that measure and continue with a backup arsenal that, although limited, represented a strategic victory. At the end of that long battle, When the clues led to important names and the financial channels began to clear, we realized something fundamental. The network we had dismantled was not simply a matter of visible faces, but a system entrenched in multiple layers, a culture of impunity and fear that required not only trials, but a systemic and profound change. That thought made the emotional burden more complex. We understood that our effort was not enough, and that continuity, social commitment, and political will would be necessary to achieve genuine change. Suddenly, a forgotten clue on the device that served as a starting point for this odyssey resurfaced strongly. It was a hidden folder with just a few files that seemed insignificant at the time, but now, with gained perspective, contained historical keys linked to previous movements and testimonies that no one wanted to hear years ago. That folder reminded us that fights for justice are not straight lines, but paths full of twists, obstacles, and moments where memory plays an essential role. Revisiting those documents, I felt a deep respect for those who started this task and who perhaps never saw their efforts recognized. The weight of all that was overwhelming, but also brought forth a renewed conviction. Justice is not a goal, but a constant and often thankless process, where every revealed truth is a partial victory and a reason to continue. What began as a simple case, derived from forgotten file, had transformed into a crusade that involved not only bodies and documents, but lives, emotions, fears, and intertwined hopes. In that context, I understood more than ever that forensic work goes beyond science and technique. It is a human task that demands dedication, ethics, and above all, a heart willing to uphold the truth even when it hurts. That lesson, the one I learned firsthand, and in the gaze of every team member, was the true essence of what it means to be a forensic doctor committed to justice. And although many questions remained unanswered and invisible forces ready to keep resisting, the certainty that we had lit a light in the midst of darkness was stronger than any threat. The fight will continue, but now with a conviction that every step, no matter how small, harvested a less uncertain tomorrow. Because the truth, no matter how minimal it may seem at first, has the power to change the world. And sometimes it all begins with a forgotten file and a brave decision to seek what many want to keep hidden. I remember that hidden folder. At first, seemed like a simple resurgence of digital dust, an inert relic of the past that we decided to review almost out of routine, like leafing through an old book without expecting to find a new story. But that night, everything changed. Among those forgotten files were recordings, testimonies, and encrypted documents that, in their apparent fragmentation, contain a latent truth, almost delayed in time. I stayed for hours in front of the screen, with only the dim light of the monitor illuminating my tired face, while every clue, every word, resonated within me with unexpected force. What we found was evidence of a network much more complex and ancient than we had imagined. It wasn't just about contemporary crimes or corrupt officials. It was a system that had taken deep roots at different levels of public administration, connected to economic groups that silently shaped entire decades of policies and decisions from shadows. It was not an invisible network, but an accumulation of small pieces lodged in daily life, in the complicity of minimal gestures, in the indifference of those who preferred to look the other way. That revelation brought with it an overwhelming weight, because we understood we were facing something that transcended a single investigation. It was a toxic legacy that threatened not only justice, but the very essence of public trust. Moving forward with that in our hands meant crossing a boundary. We knew that now any movement could trigger alarms we had not foreseen before. Paranoia kept growing, but this time it was mixed with a nearly unbearable combination of fear and responsibility. We couldn't let ourselves be intimidated, because we knew that every file, every word, could be the pivot that turned the whole board and gave voice to those who had been silenced for years. Little by little, we began to weave the testimonies and documents with what the team had gathered so far. Especially striking was a file that contained details about a public infrastructure project that, on the surface, seemed legitimate and well-planned. But when analyzing the numbers, dates, and signatures, we discovered rigged contracts, unfinished works, and payments made to fictitious accounts. That mess also intersected with a key figure within the local government, someone until then untouchable and publicly respected. That connection was the breaking point, because it led us to delve not only into economic corruption, but also into the political web that kept everything protected. But nothing prepared us for what came next. One early morning, when the tension seemed unbearable, I received an encrypted message that resembled a veiled warning. It informed a clandestine meeting of several individuals involved in the network, a gathering that could be the perfect opportunity to capture irrefutable evidence or at least trigger a new level of surveillance. Without hesitation, I informed the team, and we prepared with a mobile, discreet device, intending to infiltrate the meeting and record any direct proof. I felt as if every step we took was putting us on the edge of an abyss, aware that a false move could put us in immediate danger. The night of the meeting, we moved with the caution silence demands, under a cloudy sky that seemed to foretell the storm awaiting us. Stealthily, we entered a small room hidden on the outskirts of the city, where several prominent figures were gathered, some even holding seemingly honorable public positions. What we heard was an implicit confession, a network of secrets shared with the carelessness of those who know their impunity is guaranteed. We recorded key details, amounts crossing borders, names of shell companies, agreements to silence suspicions, and, most disturbing, mentions of methods to influence the judicial system. That night, I went home with a queasy stomach and a bitter mix of triumph and desolation. We had the proof we needed, but also the certainty that we were facing an enemy more powerful and ruthless than we could have imagined. In the following days, the pressure rose exponentially. Rumors about our investigation began circulating, with targeted attempts to discredit me publicly. Intimidating messages arrived, anonymous calls that made it clear we were in the sights of forces that would respond without mercy. But I felt, for the first time, external solidarity, as several independent media outlets and activists began supporting our work, organizing forums and reports that reflected the dimension of the problem. That alliance was a breath of fresh air amid the siege, a reminder that we were not alone, and that truth had allies across society. Meanwhile, the team did not lose momentum. Each advancement meant reviewing thousands of documents, preparing protocols to protect witness integrity, and ensuring that every piece of evidence was collected with the rigor necessary for future legal proceedings. That routine, although exhausting, kept us firm, connected to a purpose that was no longer just professional but vital. In those long nights of collaborative work, I felt a kind of silent brotherhood forming, a tacit pact where everyone gave themselves without reservation to a cause greater than ourselves. However, the hardest blow was yet to come. As we delved into the contacts of the network, we learned of an attack on another protected witness. Luckily, they survived but were marked forever. That explicit violence only confirmed the gravity of the terrain we were on and reminded us with brutal clarity that this fight was not only against corruption and complicity, but also against an absolute contempt for life and justice. For the first time in weeks, I saw in my colleagues' eyes a reflection of genuine, palpable fear, but also a determination that seemed to surpass any anguish. That experience led us to tighten security measures even more, redefine our strategies, and above all, activate a support network made up of human rights organizations that provided international protection and visibility. The feeling of being increasingly watched contrasted with an unexpected impulse. A commitment was born not only to truth but to the dignity of those who dared to speak. That was the engine that pushed us forward, even when everything seemed to conspire to close the doors. It was inevitable that, faced with these attacks, our relationship with formal justice and authorities became critical and tense. Some instances offered collaboration, but others showed resistance and legal obstacles seemingly designed to frustrate each step. Despite this, we remained firm in the conviction that only with integrity and persistence could we break down that wall. It was in that context that, thanks to the newly revealed documents, we decided to submit a final compendium to federal anti-corruption agencies, hoping it would no longer be possible to ignore the magnitude of the case. The delivery of that compendium was neither simple nor public. It was done privately, in offices where silence and tension seemed palpable, with a hope that this evidence would not only be accepted, but also trigger judicial processes that until then seemed utopian. Leaving that meeting, I was filled with a mixture of relief and anxiety. I knew it was just one step, and that the real battle might begin in the courts or in the arenas of political power, where enemies were not only people but entrenched structures resistant to change. As I recovered strength for what was to come, I reflected deeply on all that had happened. This case, which began as just another investigation, had transformed me professionally and personally. I understood that the justice we seek is not a destination to reach quickly, but a hard path traversed with doubts, dangers, and a constant need to reinvent oneself. I remember that forgotten file that ignited the spark of this story, and I felt immense gratitude toward that small margin of blue ink that was not ignored, that revealed a truth many wanted to bury. Still, I knew the enemy would not surrender easily. The following days were filled with veiled threats and strange movements around my life and that of my colleagues. But there was something deeper than the threat. The echo of voices that accompanied us, the lives that could change with our steps. That inner strength was what kept me standing. We continued to work with the conviction that every small gesture, every analyzed document, every protected testimony was a brick in construction of a more authentic justice. Truth is capricious, hiding in minimal yet valuable details, and only those willing to look patiently and without prejudice can discover it. It is a lesson I now share with anyone willing to listen, because in this profession, in the end, it's not just about bodies or documents, but about giving voice to those the system has silenced and sustaining the truth with the courage it deserves. So, as I write these words and review the reports one last time, I know our battle is just beginning. We have no certainty that change will be immediate or that justice will come without difficulties, but we do have the firm confidence that every truth, no matter how small or hidden it seems, has the power to transform realities and sow hope. And sometimes, just sometimes, it all begins with a forgotten file, a brave decision, and a heart willing not to give up. That as the days passed, the tension within the team grew, heavy like a shadow that refused to lift. Every new report, every additional testimony we tied to that hidden network brought us closer to an outcome we sensed was dangerous and final. Paranoia was no longer just an emotional state, but part of the atmosphere, a constant seeping into every conversation, in every glance we cast over our shoulders. Yet, there was something paradoxically empowering in that oppressive atmosphere. We became aware of the historical importance of what we held in our hands, that this investigation would not just be a point in our careers, but a precedent for all those who would want to follow the path of truth in Mexico. I especially remember one early morning, shortly after we received the last encrypted message, when the air seemed to have a different density. We were in the office, gathered around an improvised table, surrounded by papers and screens, reviewing the details of the most compromising file. There, in that quiet but charged moment, we decided it was time to risk everything and request collaboration from a federal intelligence agency that, although cautious, was willing to listen. We knew that opening that door meant exposing ourselves even more, but also that it was the only way to protect our witnesses and ensure the evidence would not end up in the hands of those who could destroy it without a trace. It was then that I felt, with an almost terrifying clarity, that we were facing something much bigger than ourselves, a power network crossing known boundaries, with roots extending to other states and perhaps abroad. This process of opening brought with it a chain of events that pushed us into unknown terrain. Soon, unexpected movements started, documents disappearing from the system, emails being deleted, and most disturbing of all, the appearance of hooded figures near our homes. I never knew if these were mere threats or organized acts of surveillance, but the truth is that the tension was felt in every step we took. Still, the team kept its composure, understanding that fear in such cases was a tool of the enemy to stop us, to fracture our unity, and they did not succeed. One of the most unexpected twists came thanks to a collaborator who, after weeks of silence out of fear, finally decided to break her silence in a clandestine interview. There she revealed that the web infected not only the economy and politics, but also sensitive areas of the judicial system, with judges and prosecutors under the indirect control of this network. It was a devastating blow and a huge risk, but that confession gave the case a new dimension and awakened the attention of national media, which began following the investigation more rigorously. However, that brought immediate consequences. Political pressure increased, and the maneuvers to discredit our work became more aggressive. Anonymous publications appeared on social media, attempting to associate us with dark interests as a way to sow doubt in public opinion. I recall one particularly difficult night when a close colleague and friend called me with a trembling voice to tell me he felt he was being followed. That feeling of vulnerability hit us all. It was a moment when I understood that danger had ceased to be a mere possibility and had become a tangible reality. But it was also the moment when, for the first time, I felt that our fight was not only against the corrupt or the powerful, but against fear itself. And that is where true courage is forged, in knowing that even if you fall, the mere decision to get back up is already a victory. At that point, fieldwork became a race against time, gathering testimonies, protecting informants, documenting every irregularity with almost obsessive meticulousness. It was exhausting, yes, but within that fatigue and symbiosis was born that united us beyond professional duty. We became guardians not only of evidence, but of hopes, aware that we were holding a fragile piece of justice that could break at any moment if someone betrayed our trust. For that reason, every word, every document we shared was reviewed 1,000 times. There was no margin for error. Amid this whirlwind, one of the episodes that marked me most was receiving a video with unprecedented footage recorded at a private party where several key figures of the network discussed, with total impunity, details about how to manipulate bids and protect themselves. The rawness of that footage was almost cinematic, but the most disturbing thing was the calm with which they spoke. It was a clear portrait of the absolute power they wielded, of their cynicism and certainty that nothing and no one could touch them. Sharing that material with the team and the lawyers was a moment of complete silence. We knew that fragment could be a key piece to dismantle an entire corruption network, but also a bomb that could explode against us at any moment. We then decided to use that video in a very calculated strategy, conditional dissemination, first within secure circles and then through allies and the press, preparing society for the impact that was coming. Public attention began to grow exponentially, along with the responsibility of every action. For the first time in months, I felt the power to turn evidence into collective awareness, to convert fear into outrage, and that outrage into the possibility of change. But just when we thought we had a clear path, the unexpected happened. A technical sabotage attempt left us without access to all the digital databases we had gathered. It was like losing air. Hours and hours of work disappeared, swept away by a cyber attack that left the lab almost in organizational ruins. We recovered thanks to physical copies and double verification we had implemented, a protocol we learned over time and that ended up being our salvation. That day was a brutal lesson about the fragility of truth in the digital age, and about how the search for justice can also be a chess game where every move must anticipate an unexpected counter. As the investigation progressed, I also began to notice a subtle but constant change within us, a maturity forged in daily battles. Our faces no longer showed just fatigue, but a complex mix of pride, frustration, and hope in equal doses. Because we knew we were doing something bigger than a simple report or a scientific investigation. We were reclaiming the lost dignity of a city, and perhaps, with luck, laying a foundation so that no one would ever be silenced again. One night, while reviewing the last documents, I found a handwritten note someone had forgotten in an old file, a phrase that seemed lost but resonated with unexpected strength. Patience is the best weapon to overcome silence. That hit me straight in the soul, because at that moment I understood that all the effort, all the waiting, all that exhaustion tinged with fear and courage, was part of the necessary mechanism for the truth to emerge not only in the courts but in collective consciousness. And that truth, once awakened, could open paths no one had dared to imagine before. It is hard to put into words what it means to hold in your own hands the certainty of having unmasked such a large and deep-rooted lie. But even harder is to explain the weight of knowing that this truth is not a final destination, but the start of a constant battle. Because corruption has many faces, and even if we manage to dismantle one structure, there will always be others waiting to rise again. So, as a closing thought, I want to make something clear to those who hear the story. No matter how small or insignificant the proof or clues you find along your path may seem, never underestimate the power you hold. Every detail, every forgotten file or silenced testimony is an opportunity to change the narrative, to illuminate with the light of truth places where darkness seemed eternal. And even if fear knocks on your door, remember that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. In this profession, justice is not an easy reward nor a trophy won without wounds. It is a path full of thorns, where success is measured not only in verdicts, but in the impact we leave on those forgotten, and the strength we find to keep searching for answers when all seems lost. So if something from this story stays in your mind, I want it to be this thought. Truth has patience, it is relentless, and it is everywhere, waiting to be discovered in those corners many prefer to ignore. And when someone dares to face it head-on, with bravery and without fear of solitude, then nothing and no one can stop the justice it promises. That is the lesson my most surprising case as a forensic doctor left me with, a file that, in its silence, revealed the truth and taught me that no matter how forgotten it may seem, justice always finds its way if we're willing to listen and defend it until the end.